Well, hi there, Vaughn.
And good morning, Harold.
Thanks for taking a moment with us to catch your breath at the end of another busy week. So much going on, but I guess we should start with the big news yesterday, the pipeline MOU between Alberta and Ottawa, and what that means for BC and for the Premier.
Well, it was, I think, a surprise to Premier Eby that this memorandum of understanding between the Prime Minister and the Premier of Alberta went as far as it did. You know, the Premier has been discounting this thing for some weeks. He called it, the pipeline proposal was just a $20 million communication strategy to help the Premier of Alberta get through a party convention. He called it a figment of the imagination. Well, that's some figment. That agreement, whatever you think of it, is pretty substantial, pretty detailed. And I was struck yesterday by the Premier's response, which they staged an event out in front of the legislature with all of the NDP MLAs, doing the Canadian flag and saying we're still going to stand up to this thing. But when we got to comments from the Premier, he really came down to earth. He said, well, we can't stop this thing in the courts. He pretty much acknowledged BC doesn't have a veto over it. He started to talk about, some alternatives and things we could do, maybe ocean spill safety, back to talking about how we could upgrade the existing pipeline. It sounded to me like a politician who, yes, he knew the agreement was coming, but it went farther than he thought it would. And he's now realizing that British Columbia is going to have to confront reality here. And that reality, well, the pipeline may not be a figment of the imagination.
Well, and I think you were noting that the NDP also jumped on this as a fundraising opportunity.
Yeah, even if the politicians don't know what to say, the folks at party headquarters always have their eye on the ball. How can we raise money off this, right? So, yeah, they're asking party supporters to contribute $400 by tomorrow. So, end of the month, Saturday. To fight this thing. And look, I don't blame political parties. Now that we're in the era of big money is passed, they've got to hit everything to raise money. The irony, of course, is that in the legislature this session, the New Democrats have been attacking the Conservatives who are raising money off the Cowichan Aboriginal title case. And the New Democrats are saying, well, that's divisive. Yes, it is divisive. And so is it divisive to take on the Prime Minister and the Premier of Alberta to raise money off the pipeline that you say you don't want. But I guess looking ahead, you kind of go, where is this leading? There are, as our coverage and other coverage have pointed out, major obstacles still to be achieved here. First Nations, to what degree do they have to consent, or will they accept the trade-off of equity in the project? To what degree will private investors come forward and help pay for this? Will the government of Alberta end up kind of putting the whole thing together, they say by next summer, through a Crown corporation? I mean, there's still a lot of unknowns here, but I guess the big news of the week.
Yeah, the big one, as you say, being it's always follow the money with these things, isn't it? Like, is there really anyone who wants to go all in on this kind of a project?
You're right. But, again, the sign that this thing is more real than the critics realized was the resignation this year of the most Trudeauite, most strongest opponent of pipelines and fossil fuels, Guilbeault, who was the Prime Minister's lieutenant in Quebec and a cabinet minister, and he quit over this. So I really think that if you think back, 2 years ago, would we have imagined that the carbon tax would be dead, that the BC government would be abandoning its electric vehicle targets, which it did as well, that we'd be talking seriously about the possibility of an oil pipeline through northern British Columbia. We'd be talking seriously about what the MOU says, which is that the federal government will look at lifting the moratorium on tankers on the North Coast. Like, the world has undergone a major transformation, not just here, but everywhere. And the whole climate change activism, anti-fossil fuel sentiment is in retreat, I would say more than we would have imagined 2 years ago.
Interesting. Well, and on the political side, our colleague Alec Lazenby was invited into John Rustad's office this week, where he dared the premier to call an election, a pipeline election.
Yeah. And he did. And at first you go like, what the hell is he thinking of? And then you see that opinion poll that we had yesterday, that Angus Reid saying, you know what, British Columbians aren't opposed totally the way they used to be back in the TMX days to an oil pipeline. They actually are open to the idea. So again, when you think about why EB's comments this week were so sobering, and why Rustad is saying go ahead and call an election on this issue, maybe the NDP polling and the Conservative polling is telling the parties the same thing that the Angus Reid poll told everybody, which is, hey, the mood has changed out there around all this stuff, and maybe a pipeline is not unthinkable anymore.
Well, you also wrote this week about the latest fiscal update. We've heard a lot about debt and deficit, but even by those standards, it's pretty extraordinary.
My executive summary of the financial report we got yesterday from the EB government was pathetic. I mean, the finance minister always tries to say something positive about their accomplishments over this is the first 6 months of the financial year. And the best she could come up with was that they had thought the deficit for the year was going to be $11.6 billion, which would have been a record. And they managed to get it down to $11.2 billion, which is still a record. If that's the best you can do on the fiscal front, which is the worst financial result we've ever had in provincial history, and a reversal of what John Horgan left behind 3 years ago. So 3 years ago, Horgan left behind a surplus of $6 billion. EB's accomplishment is a record deficit of $11 billion. So that's a turnaround of $17 billion in just 3 years. Like this, I've been, covering provincial budgets for a long time. I guess I've covered more than 40 of them. And this is the biggest reversal I've seen in a very short period of time. And the minister, Brenda Bailey, was asked, well, you've talked about getting things under control. How are you doing? And she said, well, we're on target to identify $300 million in savings. She didn't say where they are. And that's 0.3% of what they're spending this year. And she said, well, we've reduced the public service by 700 people. Again, didn't tell us where they are, but when pressed said, well, through attrition and not filling vacancies. And they took the savings from the 6-week strike and they translated that into a payroll saving and said, okay, so that's the equivalent of saving a number of positions. So she was asked about the savings and she said, but we probably lost more money on the liquor stores being closed than we saved on the payroll. So, I mean, this government has dug itself into a financial hole, Harold, that is going to probably it'll take years, maybe decades, to get us back into the black in British Columbia.
Well, it was interesting when you compare the John Horgan situation to the EB situation, just in 3 years, seeing debt servicing costs go up from $2.7 billion a year to $5.1 billion. I mean, and I think that's something the average reader can understand. That's like your credit card payment, right? That's like your tax on your interest on your credit card. So that's 2.4 billion that we could be spending on other things. And I just did a quick back of the envelope thing. I looked at just as an example, the Surrey School District, the largest school district in the province, their budget for this year, their capital plan, their ask of the province over the next 5 years for 15 new schools totaling $2.37 billion. So, I mean, it's the equivalent of that kind of money, right? That could buy hospitals, it could buy nurses, it could buy any number of things.
Yeah, I mean, we sort of put the interest payments on a list with all the ministries of government. So each ministry has a budget. Well, the other news this year is that interest payments passed the education ministry as an annual cost. So it's now the second biggest ministry in government. The only ministry in government that takes more money than what we spend on interest payments is health. And British Columbia for a long time, because it had managed the debt, and that includes under Horgan, didn't spend much money servicing the debt because it was relatively small. But we're now into the realm where it's becoming one of the biggest drains on provincial finances. And again, in just 3 years, because EB has run these massive deficits. And if you look down the road, they're projecting an enormous deficit next year and one the year after that. They'll all be records. And the provincial debt, well, it was high under Horgan, $89 billion, but that's everything. All, you know, crown corporations, everything, school districts, all that. It's at 155 billion now, and it's headed for 200 billion. And they'll say, well, you know, we're building schools and hospitals. Look, again, it's just operating expenses. It's what they're paying to keep the lights on and pay salaries and run government programs, because they're spending more and all of that than they're bringing in revenue. So it's a real genuine fiscal mess. And I don't see a way out of it. I would say that if you look at big projects, like the mines are talking about, expanding LNG, building another pipeline, that's probably the best bet in the long run, is that we can grow our way out of it. But they're going to have to approve an awful lot of major projects before they get to the point where they can actually look at growing their way out of this mess.
There were also changes to the Mental Health Act this week, another topic that caught your attention. Why is that?
Well, this is a strange one. So the Mental Health Act in British Columbia, which allows people to be detained and treated involuntary because they have mental health issues. And the act is being challenged in court. And what's being challenged in court is the ability under the act to treat people with drugs, restraints, things like electroshock, without their consent. And that's what's being challenged in court. And that court case just wrapped up week before last. Government has brought in legislation to take out of the law, amend one of the most controversial provisions in the act after the court case ended. And we're going, why are you doing this? And they admitted, well, we're worried that the government's going to lose the case. And if it loses the case, the healthcare workers, doctors and nurses who administered that treatment without consent could be sued. So we want to protect them from being sued. And I'm kind of going, you just figured out now that you might lose this case? This case has been around for 10 years. It went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada and came back. Like, it's incredible that only in the last week did they go, we might lose this thing. I guess we better protect the people that work in the system from being sued. And they bring in a last-minute bill to do that. I mean, it does not build confidence in the government that they have to do something that desperate after the court case is over. And the premier said, well, you know, our lawyers can go in and tell the judge that we've brought in these amendments and she might want to reopen the case. and rehear the arguments. And I'm going, I wonder how the judge is going to react to that.
Right.
Is she really going to say, she's going to say, wait a minute, you people have known about this possibility for months, and you're only now, after we've heard closing arguments, suggesting you might want to revisit this issue? I mean, I just, it looks to me like a government in a horrible scramble, making things up as they go along.
That whole area of mental health and holding people against their will, it's fraught. I know. I mean, for any government, so it's a challenging piece.
Yeah. No, but other governments have lost this argument in court. In fact, the premier admitted that. Some other provinces have already lost on this issue. So again, why are you fighting it and leaving in the law the most contentious provision, the provision that drives advocates for the mentally ill crazy and their families crazy, says that people who've been detained and who are treated are deemed to have consented to it, even if they haven't consented to it. Like, that strikes me as the kind of thing that a court might take a dim view of. It's been in the law for 40 years. It's one of the subjects of the challenge. Anyway, I guess we'll find out whether the judge reopens the case or whether what we get is a verdict or a judgment at some point in the new year. The case just wrapped up. That, I don't know. As I said, the government has now acknowledged they didn't say probably going to lose, but they said might lose in a way that suggested they probably are going to lose.
All right. Thanks again, Vaughn. We'll chat again next week.
Talk again next week.